Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. Now, there are billions of mobile and smartphones in the world, but just how closely do we pay attention to how they're made? The words cassiterite, coltan and wolframite may mean nothing to the average person, but without these minerals, among others, those small devices we take for granted would not be possible. There is skyrocketing demand for consumer gadgets, many of which contain precious metals sourced from the Democratic Republic of Congo. The dilemma is how to regulate their extraction. To this end, the US Congress passed the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act. In short, this calls for multinationals to take accountability and responsibility for the stuff they get from the ground. The checks determine whether the materials they purchased have contributed to armed groups and prolonged conflict in the DRC. The impetus for conflict minerals legislation stems from resource-fueled conflicts in eastern parts of the DRC between 1994 and 2003. So what is the moral responsibility of governments, companies and consumers like you and me over the supply chain of electronic gadgets? Well, to discuss this, I'm pleased to be joined in the studio by Dustin Benton, Head of Resource Stewardship at the Green Alliance. Also here in London is Dr. Phil Clark, who is a lecturer in international politics at the School of Oriental and African Studies. That's here in London. On the line, we have Emily Norton, Assistant Campaigner for Conflict Resources at the Global Witness Group. And also on the line, Jean-Marie Bidanda Masubulu, who's leader of the Congolese Conservative Party. Welcome to you all. Phil, can you just explain what minerals we are talking about here and how they're extracted?
We're talking about a range of minerals, some of which you've already mentioned. Cassiterite and coltan would be the main ones. I guess they're best known as key elements in the construction of mobile phones, smartphones, computer chips, etc. They're extracted in Congo often by very crude means, often by hand. And we've seen in many of the mines in eastern Congo young children and a wide range of employees doing this very, very difficult work of extracting this from the ground. So it's a very ad hoc kind of extraction process. But then I guess once we go beyond that, it's a very broad network of export that involves a range of middlemen. It involves actors in the wider region in Central Africa, and suddenly these very crude minerals find themselves on the international market. So it's quite a complicated and quite sophisticated process.
Dustin, if, as Phil says, minerals are kind of extracted at a relatively ad hoc basis, I mean, is there an industrialized nature, at least in some of the ways that these minerals are being extracted from the ground?
They're certainly being extracted at an industrial scale, and one of the big challenges that Green Alliance is concerned about is the environmental impact of doing this. I mean, we've seen lots of ecological damage from this process, in addition to all of the conflict that's being fueled. It's certainly not a very clean industry, and indeed you might argue that a bit more professionalization might go some way to improving the outcomes.
Jean-Marie, how do the minerals and the money from the minerals go towards financing conflict?
Normally, virtually none of them are exported by Congo itself. Thousands of tons of raw minerals are smuggled across the border into Uganda and Rwanda, where they are exported to the Far East and smelted with minerals from all over the world, making it very hard to trace the origin of the metals and alloys producer.
Is that because of a lack of governance? I mean, we're talking about multinational companies here, and presumably they would like to see some kind of degree of professionalism and transparency in how they get those minerals in the first place.
Absolutely, we have to understand something in Congo. When it comes to the government is not accountable to all impunity that's going on or that took place in Congo since the coming of a third regime in Congo after Mobutu was ousted. So, I mean, the cycle is still continuing. Up to date is a serious lack of rule of law. As my predecessor said, is exactly the way the minerals being extracted is very, as we say, artisanal, is not industrialized kind of work they're doing over there. I think is not structured. There is no landsman, apparently, what's going on in Congo with regard to these mineral resources.
Emily Norton, so are multinational companies exploiting this lack of transparency and perhaps this lack of governance?
Yes, I think certainly company responsibility is a key concern for an organisation like Global Witness. Our view is that companies have long had a responsibility to check their supply chains and to take responsibility for managing risks like human rights abuses in their supply chains. And that's really flowed out of standards set by the UN. And that's the basis of a lot of the work we do. The UN sets a standard both for states having a duty to ensure that their companies the companies in their jurisdiction don't contribute to human rights abuses. But the UN has also set out standards making it very clear that companies, including multinational companies, do have a responsibility to check their supply chains for these sort of risks.
Jean-Marie, what are the working conditions like in these mines?
Very terrible. Last time we were watching a program on Congo, how the mineral resources are being extracted by even the teenagers, the children that are supposed to be attending schools. They don't go to school because the reason being, first of all, as you just mentioned, if there is a lack of seriousness with regard to the government, how the government how to restrict to structure the schooling and the payment of the teachers and all these things, because the children are going into the mine just to extract the mine. Even you can see even 6 or 5 year old children going to extract the mine, going to the mine to extract the tin, cassiterite, and all this coltan stuff.
How old did you say they are? 5 and 6 years old?
Yeah, you can find 5 and 6 year old kids doing this. This is really deplorable. It's very sad. It's very sad. If we don't guarantee the future of these children, then we have to ask ourselves what kind of government is this? What I'm saying is a very accountable issue here. If there are people can go down to Congo, in eastern of Congo, they go down to the mine. I know it's a very dangerous area, but I mean, the journalists, they do have access to some extent. And they will find out there are children aged between 5 and 10 who are actually working in the mines. This is not acceptable in the 21st century. We have to stand on the way of these who are abusing the children, the children's future. I am really very sad and desperate to find out why this situation cannot be eradicated in Congo. Since 1994, up to date, when it comes to minerals, all the exploitation they're making, or the exploiting children, exploiting minerals, there is no future for these kind of children.
Phil, is there any sense of what proportion of mines are staffed by these extremely young children?
No, it's only some of them, and I think it's important to point that out, that there are different types of mining situations in Eastern Congo, different types of companies. But I think that Jean-Marie is right to point out that a large percentage of the mines are of this very ad hoc artisanal nature, and many young children are employed, many other local people are employed. One of the real tensions, I think, when we think about the mineral industry in Eastern Congo is that, yes, on the one hand, the working conditions are terrible. Undoubtedly, there is a role that minerals play in fueling conflict, but this is also an industry that employs an enormous swathe of the population. And one of the difficulties that we've seen in recent years with much of the legislation that's been used to try and constrain the mining industry is that it, in fact, has become an effective embargo, which has led to massive unemployment in a part of Congo where economic conditions are already extremely harsh. So this is an industry that has many problems, but it's also one of the very few economic lifelines for much of the population as well.
Emily, I mean, what do you think of that? It's clearly a key part of the DRC's economy, so it does need to be protected.
We absolutely agree with that. I do think, though, that we would disagree that legislation necessarily leads to an embargo in this sort of situation. And I think there is a lot of debate about the effects of the legislation that was just referred to, but certainly it's an incredibly nuanced situation on the ground. There are an array of other factors that we're talking about here. For example, there was a presidential ban of mining that lasted some time and really had a disastrous effect. And we're not talking about a direct link with a legislation that has only just been enforced. We're just seeing the results of that legislation. So I just want to clarify that I think the embargo dynamic there's a huge amount of nuance that needs to be recognised there. The livelihoods of people on the ground are absolutely critical, and artisanal mining has been a difficult livelihood for an incredibly long time, long before Dodd-Frank. The difference now is that companies are scrutinising their supply chains from the region. They are becoming aware of these realities. They're becoming aware of what these difficult livelihoods involve, and they're becoming aware of the risks involved. So companies now, many of them, and again, I'd say this is very much triggered by legislation in the US and also legislation now in Congo, but companies are now taking steps to work together along the supply chain. They're working together with civil society. They're working together in initiatives to address these sort of risks.
Okay, but Emily, from your perspective, from Global Witness's perspective, what's the most important thing? That the money from these resources don't fund conflict, or that there's a degree of transparency and that children as young as 5 aren't forced down into these mines?
From our perspective, the most important thing is that we have transparent supply chains that enable companies to check what is going on and whether they are funding conflict, whether there is an issue with child labour in their mines, whether there is an issue with severe human rights violations in their supply chains. And we believe that transparency is absolutely key here. We need to be able to see what these companies are doing to then break that dynamic.
Jean-Marie, I mean, we're talking about a lot of different companies. I'm just wondering, are some better than others?
I mean, we have to ask ourselves a question when it comes to transparency. First of all, who profits from these minerals? Not the miners or the porters. The mineral trade is a valuable source of income for the government, soldiers, and rebels alike. They often don't receive any salaries, those soldiers, but it's only the people right at the top of the hierarchy, the warlords and army commanders, that are really making any money though. And that money is usually used to buy more weapons to maintain their control on the territory and the population. So the cycle of violence continues. I mean, as Emily said, to track the chain of production is going to be very difficult if there is no strong rules governing the institution of mining. Otherwise, it's going to be very difficult. As I said, if the mine's coming from Congo, going through Rwanda, Uganda, or Burundi, then it loses the trace. You can't find where it's coming from. So they're selling across the globe, and everybody's just enjoying what they're getting from the minerals. But strictly speaking, if there is no law governing this, and the law, if it's not respected, then that cycle will always continue.
We'll come to the US legislation point in a minute. Dustin, just what are the environmental impacts of this level of mining, and how has it changed over the last 10 to 20 years as the demand for these products has increased exponentially?
One of the interesting things that's happened with the proliferation of electronics devices across the world is we've gone from, as a planet, using 10 to 15 major elements in all the things that we used in our lives to more like 30 or 40, many of which are these materials that occur in very minute quantities. So just to give you an example, your average smartphone has about £1.50 worth of materials, monetary value within them, of which gold is, you're talking about less than a gram of gold in each one. And for something like tantalum, it's much, much smaller than that. But the number of devices that are appearing across the world, fed by sort of consumer demand, is growing exponentially, and that's taken what was a relatively small-scale mining industry to a much, much larger environmental footprint. And particularly the artisanal mining is done in a really environmentally destructive way. We see this both on the recovery end and on the mining end, because there's no formal structure. When you're desperately poor and you need to mine to make money, you aren't concerned with where you're dumping the silt into the rivers, for example. You're not concerned with the number of trees you're cutting down. You're not concerned with the chimpanzee habitat that's being destroyed. You're not being concerned about the watersheds that are being destroyed because you're too poor, and that's entirely understandable. What we need is some supply chain transparency and some investment in places like the Congo so that the mining that we do get is done in an environmentally responsible way. And I think that that's where some of the big companies that are the users of these materials can help to drive change.
But what level of environmental degradation has happened, say, specifically in DRC, as a result of this? You mentioned silt and runoff and stuff like that. Rivers being polluted.
Absolutely. All
trees
that
being cut down.
Trees being cut down. Habitat loss is the big one. It's habitat loss. It's direct pollution from the use of the materials and the mining process, both in water terms and in land use terms.
So the minerals are kind of a curse in a way.
You can mine well. That can be done, but you have to do so very carefully, and it has to be done professionally.
But is there not we're talking about multinational companies. There must be the level of expertise to provide that kind of technology to ensure that it is mined well.
I think we've got to distinguish between which companies are acting where. So the big brands that we think about, Apple, Samsung, HP, etc., use these materials, but they use them after the point at which they're smelted. And the smelter is kind of the pinch point, because it sort of erases the sort of specific character of the material. Once it's been through a smelter, you can't tell where gold has come from. Prior to that, you can tell where the ore has come from. So these companies have relatively little ability to improve the mining process. And as we've just heard, where it's artisanal mining, without clear rule of law, where you've got rebel gangs, it's very difficult to sort of get a big company in there to say, right, we're going to mine this well. And there are a whole host of other problems about land rights and all the rest of it.
And on those rebel groups, and I mean, one that springs to mind is the M23 rebel group, Phil, and that's been displacing thousands in eastern DRC. Are they involved in this, or are we talking about quite a few fragmented groups?
Yeah, so I mean, M23 is one amongst a whole range of rebel groups in eastern Congo, some of which are involved in the mining industry and others aren't. I mean, M23 to a large extent wasn't so involved in the mine. Some of its individual leaders may have been, but the group itself wasn't systematically involved, largely because it was being supported by Rwanda and Uganda. And this, I think, points to a kind of a bigger question in all of these debates about minerals, which is exactly how important are they in the bigger conflict realm. And my sense is that we talk a great deal about minerals, and quite rightly so, because they are an important issue, but they're not the most important driver of conflict in eastern Congo. So if we're interested in bringing this conflict to an end, if we're looking at durable solutions, minerals to a large extent, I think, have actually distracted us from many of the more important issues, which is about political reform. It's about dealing with ethnic and land grievances in the east. This is going to take much more systematic political engagement with the Congolese government. Minerals have partly fueled some of these rebel groups, but I don't think they explain why a conflict as destructive as it is has lasted as long as it has in this part of Africa.
Jean-Marie, I'll turn to you. I mean, what kind of chance is there for a degree of political stability in the near future in DRC? Are we seeing changes there?
Minerals come after. Normally, Congo needs a very, very structured political way. Then once political issue is settled, then everything else will be settled. Actually, I do not believe that there is a clear view for a democratic solution of political situation in Congo. It's not, because the current government, they do not want to let go. They don't want to democratize the country. There are so many political parties in Congo, but there is no single law in the past legislation or in the current legislation, and that allows the development of a political party, of let's say freedom of speech, and so on and so forth. Political parties have really to struggle. I mean, the small political party, in my view, there is no small political party. All political parties are the same. As long as they exist, they can just grow bigger and bigger. But the problem is now, the current government in the DRC, Kinshasa, is stopping any hope of democratic society. There is no law in the parliament has not voted any law to say, right, we have to fund political parties in Congo. No, with no funding of political party. How do you expect to have a democratic society? It's no way. So those who are in power now, they intend to stay forever and ever in power. That is some kind of tradition in Africa. Things must change. We are not in the 3rd century or 15th century. This is the 21st century. I think, as I mentioned in the beginning, the world should normally have an interest in Africa to find out where things are going wrong.
Okay, well, look, I guess outlining those kind of domestic travails and the problems of governance of DRC, that has spurred the United States to action, and I mentioned it in my introduction, the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act. I'll turn to you, Emily. The crux of this act is that companies have to really submit a plan. They have to submit audits of the supply chain, and a few companies actually have managed to submit their audits ahead of the deadline, Apple, Intel and HP. I just want your view. How have the audits been?
We've certainly seen significant progress by some companies, and we've seen some really substantial reports, but unfortunately the vast majority we've seen so far, and we're obviously in the process of carrying out our analysis, are just lacking enough information. They're not including meaningful information on the steps companies are taking to check their supply chain, to check these sort of risks, to deal with these sort of risks, and they're not providing detail on the management systems in place. So it's very difficult for, regulators, civil society, investors to draw any conclusion really about the sort of efforts some companies are making to actually source responsibly and to try to avoid the risk that they are contributing to these sort of dynamics that we've been talking about.
What about the so-called Enough project that was initially mooted, which would be a check of the supply chain, but a much cheaper check of the supply chain. Was it a satisfactory start at least trying to find out the provenance of materials? It seems there was dissatisfaction with it.
Well, I think it's a good start, but let's think about how we should regulate this. I think it's clear we have to regulate at the consumption end, and that's for a couple of reasons. Firstly, regulation has to jive with public opinion, and public opinion sees the smartphone manufacturer, the electronics company, as the owner of the problem, not necessarily a smelter. I mean, nobody knows about smelters, and they're sort of scattered across the world. So there's something about, what do we think as consumers, and how should that inform regulation? Secondly, the place where the smelters are located matters a lot. If we had a US or an EU regulation covering smelters, we wouldn't cover most of the smelters that are actually doing this stuff because they're outside of the jurisdiction of the United States or the EU. But business relationships span regulatory boundaries. So if a business says, I'm not going to buy from a smelter or that doesn't guarantee me a conflict-free resource, and that business is regulated to require that that is done, then the smelters fall in line. And we've seen lots of interesting stories there. So let me give you an example from Intel. They were initially refused entry to the smelters where they get their materials from because the smelters were, thought this was a bit of bother that they could avoid. But when Intel said to them, guys, we're not going to buy from you if you don't let us know that the materials that we're using don't come from a conflict resource, all of a sudden the smelters thought, okay, this is in our direct business interest. We have to do this. The fear of the boycott was the biggest reason for smelters to participate. So I guess the final point is if we want regulation to be effective, we've got to design it so it can be, hence the focus on consumption.
Phil, I mean, just on the point of this legislation enacted in the US, the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act, do you think it's an efficient way of ensuring the provenance of minerals? I mean, checking so many sources is going to be difficult, and it's going to be very expensive. It's going to cost billions.
I mean, I think it depends what we think this legislation is intended to do. If it's designed to add some transparency to what has been a very murky industry, well, it's maybe a first step in that direction, although it does rely very heavily on the self-reporting of many of these companies and many of the mining groups on the ground in Congo. So that's a big problem. But I think the more important issue is that many of the proponents of the Dodd-Frank Act, including groups like Global Witness and the Enough Project, have also seen this very much as a vehicle to try and deal with conflict in Congo, that they've seen the mineral as absolutely central to the conflict. And I'm much more skeptical about that particular intention. I think in many ways that this legislation, if it's intended to deal with a conflict, has been a very poor substitute for real reform within Congo itself. As I mentioned before, it's a piece of legislation that I think already is doing an enormous amount of damage to the domestic economy in Congo, and it's leading to drastic unemployment. And I've seen that myself in much of my research in Eastern Congo. And in the last couple of years, tens of thousands of Congolese are now out of work because the mining industry has been so disruptive. And I think that's an enormous driver of conflict for the future. The other important issue is that many of them, the militias and the rebel groups in question, haven't in fact had their operations at all disrupted by this legislation. They've continued to operate. Conflict has continued to proliferate. The situation on the ground hasn't changed a great deal. The final point I think that often isn't mentioned in terms of the Dodd-Frank Act, of course, is that it only really constrains the activities of companies that have some basis in the US. So while this may have disrupted some US-based enterprise, we've then seen China and other actors fill the void that was left by US companies. So this doesn't have any kind of international binding dimension to it. And in many places, the mineral industry really has rolled on as it did before. So this was a very clumsy, a very blunt piece of legislation that I don't think really dealt with most of the root causes of conflict in Eastern Congo today.
And Jean-Marie, I guess, given the level of Chinese investment in that part of the world, it does need some kind of binding international agreement. Is that likely, or is that what you would like to see?
China is operating in a complicity with the Congolese government, and this is very detrimental to the Congolese people because the Congolese people, they're not beneficiaries of this deal between the Chinese and the Congolese government. If I say that because I cannot see tangibly in Kinshasa or whereas what Chinese are doing concretely, they're just looting the country, they're just getting what they want to get mineral. But I mean, it is very dangerous. I believe it's very dangerous because when it comes to this kind of contract that the Congolese government signed with China, is only, as I mentioned, is not for the benefits of the West. No, I don't think so. because they lied to the people. They said, oh, no, they're going to build the roads, they're going to build the hospital. How long have Chinese been there in Congo to do this? Just going actually in Kinshasa, just a piece. I mean, I think like 4, 5, or 10 kilometers of roads. It's not much for.
But would you like to see some kind of international binding agreement, though? I mean, European Union, China,
yes,
everyone.
Yes, they should get involved. Absolutely, they should get involved because I don't believe that was a win-win situation.
Indeed.
A win-win contract. I think the European Union should get involved. The international level of just doing affairs should also involve.
Emily, I'm interested in your view. As a consumer, what should I do? Is there such thing as a conflict-free phone? Is there a way I can offset my phone? Is that something that people should pressure, perhaps companies themselves?
I think certainly at this stage, the lack of transparency, particularly, again, we're talking about very different jurisdictions here, but if we're talking about Europe, for example, the lack of transparency at the moment, because we don't see companies publicly reporting on this sort of information, means that consumers don't have any guarantee that what they're buying, whether it's a phone or laptop, is not sort of fueling these dynamics. So as a consumer, it's absolutely about putting pressure on companies, putting pressure on governments, and that's governments in the EU, to legislate for this sort of thing. Unfortunately, as we've seen with Dodd-Frank, and obviously there are some disagreements about both the legislation but also about where it should go. Legislation is the way that we're going to change companies' behaviour.
Dustin?
Yeah, I'd just say on this point about what companies can do and what consumers can do. Right now, consumers can't express a preference. They've got a binary choice. Do I buy or don't I buy, with no information about conflict minerals? Nobody likes conflict minerals. Nobody wants them in their phone. So there isn't going to be a competitive dynamic. I think and in fact, that's not what consumers want. A number of bits of public opinion research we've done suggest that consumers just think that good stuff should be normal. Ethical practice should be normal. They don't want the choice to buy a bad phone versus a good phone. So the entire industry has got to get on board on this. There are some benefits for the industry to greater supply chain transparency, which might outweigh some of the costs of doing it. The first is material security. We know that those companies that measure and manage water, for example, outperform companies that don't. That's because they've got better supply chain management. So there's a real business benefit there. We also know that some of the visibility that we're seeing that's driven this is just going to continue to happen. So you can buy a phone with a camera on it and access to social networks for €15 in the developing world. That is a long way away from some people, but not very far away from many others. The stuff that we've seen hidden in supply chains is not going to stay hidden, and consumers in the West will see that. So these pressures aren't going to go away, and they're not just driven by regulation. I think that businesses will want to face them in a proactive way.
Do you agree with that, Phil, that none of us wants to see conflict minerals used in our phone? Because I guess these conflicts are so far away from us and we don't really know that much about them, do we?
And I think that's the first step. I think we need to educate ourselves a lot more about why conflict happens in a place like Congo. And I think a lot of the mineral discussion, again, has dodged the really more important issues around politics and political reform. And I think if we want to see change in Congo, if we want to see better labour conditions, if we want to see a conflict brought to an end, it's about pressuring our governments to in turn put pressure on Kabila's government in Congo. We have to see security sector reform. We need to see land reform. We need to see minority groups taken care of. Those are the sorts of things that will, I think, make a much more fundamental difference to all of this. The mineral issue, I think, really has just messed around the edges with what are much more fundamental are issues. And in many ways, I think that the US government in particular has used the Dodd-Frank Act to avoid having to deal with much more systematic political reform in Congo. It sees Kabila as a key ally. It doesn't want to disrupt his government. It doesn't want to push for more serious reform there. By emphasizing minerals, the US government has dodged much more deeper political issues within Congo. So I think that's where the momentum needs to be at the moment.
Sadly, we've run out of time. That's Dr. Phil Clark, a lecturer in international politics at the School of Oriental and African Studies. Dustin Benton, Head of Resource Stewardship at the Green Alliance. On the line, Emily Norton, Assistant Campaigner for Conflict Resources at the Global Witness Group. And also on the line, Jean-Marie Bedanda Masabulu, who's leader of the Congolese Conservative Party. Many thanks for joining me, Brandon Cole, on The Voice of Russia in London.